From the western border of Alberta to the far west coast of British Columbia, following the Canadian Pacific through this stretch of land is simply breathtaking. The Canadian Pacific Railway has traversed this beautiful scenery for more than 130 years. These enormous mountains have seen many generations of railroading, and will see many more to come. As we travel from Exshaw to Sqamish and back, we will advance along the engineering marvel that is the Canadian Pacific, seeing all sorts of trains along the way. Though the test of time has won against certain aspects of the CPR's history along this route, there is still a fair amount saved, telling stories of times long past. We will mainly follow CP, though some CN trains will be seen here and there, as CP and CN share similar routes from Kamloops to Vancouver. Let us begin this marvelous Railfan journey through the mountains. In Exshaw, we see this GP 38-2 3030. This locomotive has been stationed at the Greymont cement plant as one of CP's designated switchers. The plant also has their own locomotive, what I believe to be a GP9, though it was hard to tell from this angle. West of Exshaw, I ran into CP work train WLA 004 with an SD 40-2 leader. 004 was taking C36's train and dropping all but one car in Gap Yard. We got ahead of 004 and watched its arrival into Gap Yard. I really enjoy the sound of an EMD SD 40-2 gearing down as it comes to a stop. Note how the old no trespassing sign here still says CP Rail Systems at the bottom. I couldn't get a clear shot of the switching from where I was, so we leapfrogged ahead to Banff to watch him come past at speed. The station was constructed in 1910 and was declared a historic landmark in 1991. The station still serves the Rocky Mountaineer cruise train and on occasion the Royal Canadian Pacific. It is a popular tourist destination, and it also attracts a fair share of rail fans. It wasn't long before 004 came through. RTC had him lined with a high green. The one car on 004's train was headed for Lake Louise. After that, 6031 was headed light to Field and was added to the rest of the work train out there. Continuing west, we arrive at the famous Lower Spiral Tunnel. The tunnels were designed to lengthen the grade of the Big Hill, which was one of the most treacherous stretches of track in railroad history. The grade went from 4.5% to a much less steep 2.2%. While it is still a steep climb for a railway, this improved safety considerably. Trains loop over themselves inside the tunnels, and if there are over 80 cars, it is a spectacular photo opportunity as the train will be seen from the top and bottom portals. The train we see passing through the lower tunnel is CP-112, an eastbound intermodal train from Vancouver. 112 was being led by a pair of ever-so-classic AC-4400 CWs. The downside to the tunnels is that they're located in a provincial park. This means the trees will keep growing and will never be cut down, no matter what view they obstruct. Leaving the spiral tunnels behind, we arrived in Field to find CP-201 sitting by the crossing. CP-302 was having DPU trouble in the yard, so 201 did their crew change at the crossing. The crew change occurs in Field because it is the division point between the Lagan and the Mountain subdivisions. As soon as the track was clear in the yard, 201 set off for the rest of their journey west. .201 is a westbound manifest freight. It comes from Edmonton, Alberta, and runs to Coquitlam, British Columbia. 200 is the sister train that runs the opposite way. When 201 was clear the yard, RTC held eastbound traffic on the Mountain sub until 302 could get out of the way.
You called me? Yeah, there's a private lock on the cathedral as well. Daily auction.
They split the train just after the DPU and pulled ahead to clear the switch onto track 2. This procedure is called doubling over, and was necessary in this case so that they could troubleshoot the problem without blocking mainline traffic. When clear of the switch, they moved back into the yard and mainline traffic flow resumed. Notice Mount Field off in the distance behind this lumber truck.
Nope, we're good. I have no idea what the train's going to be saying. Yep, that's fine when my DPO expires at 1800. So these are
The first train through after 302 cleared was CP 400, an eastbound manifest train headed for Calgary. This pair of GEs were working really hard to pull 400 out of field. One of the coolest parts about Field, British Columbia is this building. This is the Canadian Pacific Telegraph Office, constructed in 1931. The office was used not to relay train orders, but rather for passengers to receive and reply to telegrams in the heyday of CP passenger travel. Of course, this was in the days before the advent of phones in commercial service. The dots and dashes of the telegraph were replaced with a phone switchboard in 1961. It remained in active service until 1979 when the office was closed. Passenger service ceased on this route a few years prior. The best part about the building is not only has it been preserved and somewhat looked after, but that it still stands in its original spot beside the tracks. This makes for some interesting photographic opportunities for those who like history. The office is still in typical CP building colors of the day, Tuscan with a black roof and yellow window trim. It also has stone decor around the windows and doors for added aesthetics. Shortly after 400, CP 602 came through. The train was led by two brand new rebuild units, an AC-44 CWM on point and an SD-70 ACU after. These ACUs are rebuilt from the old SD-90 43 Max that were put into storage almost 10 years ago. They were pulled out of storage recently and rebuilt to this new Tier 4 status. 602 is eastbound potash empties from CN Interchange in Sapperton. The rear DPU was a Union Pacific SD70 ACE and posed an added bonus to an already good train. Almost immediately after 602, the Rocky Mountaineer came through.
Call train 304.
The Rocky Mountaineer is a rail cruise train that presents passengers with the magnificent mountain scenery of Western Canada and America. It is privately owned, running on both CP and CN. The symbols for it on CP are 10R and 12R for eastbounds and 11R for westbounds. Notice how the majority of the cars on the train are specially built to give passengers the best possible view of the mountain scenery, while also keeping them out of the weather. These passenger cars are what make the Rocky Mountaineer one of the more unique passenger trains of today. The last car is one of the generator cars used to power the train's lights and other electrical appliances. This Rocky had another at the front of the train as well.
RTC 304-16 over. 314 Mountain South.
Notice the old searchlight signal still standing trackside. Another one stands behind it. It's hard to say just how much longer the searchlights in field will be in service, but their days are definitely numbered. Beside the west-facing signal, an aluminum LED color light signal can be seen lying on the ground, ready to take over. Searchlights are classic, serving many different railways since the 1930s. But their internal mechanisms used to change the colors make the signals less efficient and outdated by today's standards. In recent years, many searchlights have been replaced by LED color light signals, which use less power and with no moving parts don't require near as much maintenance. Despite their efficiency, however, the color lights just don't have the same feel to them as the old searchlights did, giving rail fans mixed opinions about them. But times change, so all we can do is take photos of the current railway equipment before it becomes nothing more than a memory, living on only by the photos and footage from the past. The next train wasn't for a good hour or so. We met up with CP 881 at Frame, mile 68.3 on the mountain sub. Frame is where the tracks split and diverge into the well-known Connaught and Mount Macdonald tunnels. Westbounds take the south track to the 9-mile-long Mount Macdonald tunnel, while eastbounds occupy the north track from the 5-mile Connaught tunnel. The number plates on the signals have an M and a C to identify which track the tunnels are on. The tunnels were constructed to lessen the grade through Rogers Pass. The previous solution was trestle loops inside canyons. This worked, but it required round-the-clock care to prevent train wrecks. The tunnels also keep the tracks clear of the weather. Rogers Pass can see up to 60 feet of snow in a season, so these tunnels would prove more cost-effective in the long run than the snow sheds used previously. The snow sheds were designed to keep snow off the tracks, mainly as a defense against avalanches. But with no ventilation systems, the sheds had to have gaps between them to allow exhaust to escape. but this came with its own set of challenges. Many of the 54 snow sheds were abandoned when the Connaught Tunnel was built in 1906. When the Mount Macdonald Tunnel was constructed, the Connaught was converted to a single-track tunnel as it remains today. The westbound 881 was waiting on an eastbound that got delayed due to engine trouble. That being said, RTC decided to give 881 a proceed signal. By this time it was quite dark, and out here in the mountains, when it gets dark, it gets really dark. Luckily, the Railfan truck has an LED light bar on top for illuminating trains at night. Even though it isn't the greatest shot ever, it would have been far worse if it didn't have that light bar. CP-881 is westbound coal loads. Coal trains are often long, and when loaded are also quite heavy. So usually a DPU is stationed in the middle, as well as at the end of a train. The light bar also came in handy for navigating these rural mountain service roads. Having a 4x4 truck also helps a lot. Later that night, we arrived in Revelstoke, where we stayed the night. The next morning, I was pleasantly awoken by an eastbound coal train. The tracks pass right behind the Super 8 Hotel, where I stayed. Upon arrival in Craigellachie, I was greeted by the eastbound Rocky Mountaineer once more, this one being RMR 12R. The Rocky Mountaineer uses ex-Canadian National GP40-2 LWs for the train leaders and standard cab GP40-2s purchased from a variety of American roads for the secondary units. The shot in Craigellachie wasn't the best, so the chase was on to find a better spot. This provided an opportunity for some pacing shots. I finally settled on this one just west of Three Valley Gap, the station name of Taft on the Shuswap sub. The rail cruise train paralleled the Columbia River as it ran through the beautiful BC scenery on its way east. This Rocky Mountaineer wasn't as long as the one we saw earlier in field, but it was still packed with tourists. This shot shows just how large the mountains truly are in Western Canada, next to the size of the trains. Craigellachie, home of the CPR's last spike. This is one of the more interesting highway rest stops along the Trans-Canada Highway. Home to a Canadian Pacific steel cupola caboose in dire need of paint. Craigellachie tells the history of the building of the CPR, more specifically, the last spike that was driven November 7, 1885 by Sir Donald Smith, with W.C. Van Horn and A.B. Rogers also present at the event. This historical preservation site educates tourists and members of the younger generation with one of the most important events in Canadian history, when the East was connected to the West via Canada's first transcontinental railway. This represents the last spike. It is a gold-painted spike in the CP main line, and is not the original from the completed railway. In fact, the promise of a transcontinental railway is the only reason why British Columbia agreed to join the Canadian Confederation in the first place. In addition to being an informal rest stop, Craigellachie is also home to a gift shop that sells a variety of railway souvenirs for people of all ages. Not all that far west of Craigellachie, I made a stop at Cambie East in order to catch CP 100. CP 100 is an eastbound intermodal train running cross-country from Vancouver, British Columbia to Toronto, Ontario. The train is usually identifiable by dual mid-DPUs, something that makes 100 my favorite intermodal train on CP. And one more locomotive on the rear for good measure. Trekking further down the shoe swap sub reveals CP 888 heading east through Chase. Unfortunately, this crossing is a prohibited whistle zone, so trains fly through with nothing more than a ringing bell. .888 is an eastbound unit train of coal empties running from Kamloops to Sparwood, British Columbia. Nice to see a classic golden rodent on the tail end. We stopped at Geddes because the signal was displaying a clear to stop. But after waiting half an hour, I found the train I was waiting on was actually ahead of us. The only thing at Geddes was CEFX 1057 and some CP maintenance crews. East of Savona, I found this CN eastbound manifest train crawling along the cliffside adjacent to the Kamloops Lake. I never got the symbol for this train. All I know is it had 5 locomotives on the head end, 4 of which were SD70M-2s. The other was a standard cab -8. The cut of boxcars at the front of the train were a nice bonus. The CN and CP main lines parallel each other here in the Thompson Canyon. The CN Ashcroft subdivision runs on the far side from the highway, while the CP Thompson sub runs just below the highway. This area is a truly awesome place to sit and watch trains. Just be sure your camera has at least a 40 times optical zoom on it in order to catch the trains. The tracks are usually pretty far from the various viewpoints. When I arrived in Savona, I set up on this overpass atop the CP Thompson sub, a station name of Tunqua East. The train was CP 301, westbound grain loads destined for Vancouver. A horn salute tells of a friendly crew within the cab. This was probably my favorite shot of the trip thus far.
45,
The loaded coal cars in the siding were just that, a random cut of loaded coal hoppers. I haven't a clue why they were just sitting here occupying the siding track like this, but they were here for at least 2 days. When I came back on the return trip, they were still sitting here. The back of the train was an almost mirrored image of the front, a single AC 4400 CW with its back to the train. I almost missed CP 600 here at Tunqua East. .600 came through around 3 hours after 301. I was at a hobby store called Kelly's Caboose for most of the afternoon. .600 is more eastbound potash empties. It begins life in Coquitlam, BC, and it terminates in Moose Jaw, Saskatchewan. For some reason, the rain was always coming down while the sun was out for this part of the trip, so it felt like railfanning in one of those old 7-Up commercials. By following the Trans-Canada Highway No. 1 through the Thompson Canyon between Savona and Lytton, visitors are not only treated to some beautiful scenery, but also some spectacular opportunities for railway photography. This is one of the many areas along the highway where visitors can pull over for a rest, and also film and photograph trains. This spot is located west of Spence's Bridge. At mile 57.3 on the CN Ashcroft sub and mile 55 on the CP Thompson sub, the two railways interchange. The Ashcroft handles all westbound traffic from both railways, while the Thompson sub handles all eastbound traffic, again CP and CN alike. This allows a maximum amount of trains to descend the canyons in an efficient manner. After Spence's Bridge, the CN line moves to the far end of the canyon once again, while the CP line runs on the mountainside above the highway. West of the town of Lytton, I was able to capture this shot of CP 863 descending the CN Ashcroft sub through the Fraser Canyon. This was in the last of the daylight. There are two 863s on CP. One goes from Green Hills in the States to Roberts Bank, British Columbia, while the other runs from Revelstoke to CN Interchange in Sapperton, BC. This one is the 863 from Revelstoke to CN Sapperton. Comparatively speaking, these mountains aren't near as large as the ones east of Kamloops, but their size is still overwhelming, and they effortlessly managed to dwarf this 612-axle coal train running west through the canyon. The AC 4400 in the middle and the GEVO at the back were working just as hard as the leaders as this coal train slithered along the cliffside above the Thompson River. As the sun finished setting here in the canyon, we decided to continue our journey west. We went as far as Chilliwack, where we spent the night. The next morning, it was back onto the highway headed for Sqamish. I didn't see any trains that morning, but passing through the Vancouver and West Coastal area was quite pleasant. After a 2-hour drive, we were finally here. The West Coast Railway Heritage Park is a larger-sized rail museum housing retired rail equipment from the PGE, BC Rail, CP, and CN, as well as some other surprises. This will have to be a video for another day. It is a fantastic rail museum, and I highly recommend that you check it out if you're ever in the area. After spending most of the day buried in the history that is at the Sqamish Rail Museum, it was time to return home. We took Highway 99 from Sqamish, where it joins with Highway 1 in Cache Creek. This highway is scenic, but the roads are very windy. Lots of sharp turns not to be taken faster than 30 kilometers an hour. Later that evening, we stopped in Lillooet for gas. It was here I ran into CNL 571. Unfortunately, they took BC Rail 4648 out of the consist here, but at least I got to watch the consist start up. I wasn't the only one sitting here at the crossing. A high rail truck had beat me here. What looked to be a track foreman. .571 also picked up this cut of centerbeam bulkhead flat cars while they were over here. After the 45-minute switching operation, L571 was underway once more. Dash 8 2178 was originally built for the Santa Fe in 1992. It was purchased and repainted by CN some years later. These Dash 8s never became BNSF units. They were bought by CN directly off the Santa Fe. L571 is one of CN's local freights, hence the L in the symbol. It sticks within the limits of BC, operating on the Sqamish, Lillooet, and Prince George subdivisions between Sqamish and Prince George, BC. This 571 was 2/3 cover gondola cars, built to carry steel coils, though these ones were all empty. While on my way out of Lillooet, I noticed these BC Rail wood chip cars sitting in the yard, something you don't see too often out where I live. Later that night, back on the CP shoe swap sub, I got this shot of CP 868 at Pritchard, and boy was he moving. This is the reason I don't like railfanning at night. It's really hard to see the train. Unfortunately, the truck was facing away from the tracks, so the light bar couldn't be used here. The next morning, I found myself back at Cambie East to catch CP 865. This was around 6:30 in the morning. .865 is westbound coal loads, in this case from Revelstoke to CN Sapperton. One thing about the CP shoe swap and mountain subdivisions is they are really busy, seeing anywhere from 20 to 30 trains a day, making them ideal subdivisions for railfanning. I caught up with the next train at Revelstoke. This is CP 400, an eastbound mixed train, crossing over the Columbia River on the Revelstoke Railway Bridge. The downside to this spot was I was standing on the highway bridge, so every time a truck would pass by, the bridge would shake violently. This resulted in me having to hold the tripod for most of the shot. .400 is a daily manifest train, running from Port Coquitlam Yard in BC to Alyth Yard in Calgary, Alberta. After 400, we made a quick trip to the yard and saw these CP dump cars sitting at the east end. I moved over by the Rail Museum to get this shot of CP 306 arriving in the yard. 306 is eastbound grain empties. You've heard me say DPU quite a lot by now. DPU stands for Distributed Power Unit, and refers to helper locomotives within the train that are controlled by the lead locomotive remotely. DPUs can also be called helpers, pushers, and slaves. CP uses them a lot in the mountains. The train slowed right down, as Revelstoke, like Field, is a crew change point. It is the divider between the mountain and the Shuswap subdivisions. After 306, we continued east. The scenic winding mountain highways, much like the railway, have snow sheds along the way to keep avalanches from blocking the road. These snow sheds may look familiar. They are modernized designs of the sheds CP abandoned long ago. Unlike the sheds of the old railway, these ones are constructed of concrete instead of wood, making the structures more durable. Eventually, I arrived in Fort Siding, where I caught up with CP 400 once again. But 400 was stopped, waiting for something else. That something else soon appeared, a westbound intermodal train, what I believe to be CP 113, though I'm not certain. Since 113 had track priority, and there was nothing else in its way, it was soon racing past at a fair click. As soon as 113's back end cleared, 400's crew made their way back onto the train. It wasn't long before 400 was underway. I love the back-to-back pair of AC 4400s leading the train today, especially because 9832 still had an old mechanical steel bell. Those bells really added character to the GEs of the 90s and early 2000s. .400 was moving slowly because he was transferring from the south to the north track. You'll see why in just a bit. DPU 8067 was sandwiched between a TTX waffle boxcar and an old 50-foot CP rail boxcar. Here is one of the ways to tell which track is the south or north track. On CP, if there are signals around, take a glance at the number board. This one says 454S. 454 is the signal number, and S means south. The other signal says 454N for north. When the train cleared, I resumed my journey east, but didn't get far before finding out why 400 changed tracks. Another train, put in the hole by RTC, was on the same track as 400 was before. Soon this westbound was underway. The westbound was another mixed freight, though I never got the symbol. Based on the fact it was a manifest train with no real pattern, it was likely 401, which is 400's sister train. This 401 had a decent cut of boxcars in its train, including this 50-foot high-cube boxcar in CP's new scheme. This crossing is used extensively by cement trucks. Immediately after 401, another westbound came through. This was a loaded coal train, likely 879. This shot shows the signals here at the east end of Ford Siding. For some reason, these searchlights have no targets around the lights, making them stand out from other signals along the line. Later that afternoon, I made another visit to Field. It was here I caught CP 303 pulling in from Cathedral. Similar to the 301 we saw at Tonquah East earlier, 303 is Vancouver-bound grain loads, more specifically, headed for Thorn Yard. This is what a westbound crew change usually looks like in Field. The locomotives stop over at the old station, as the rest of the train fouls the crossing. After 2 to 5 minutes, the train is back underway. This was the last train I saw on this trip. I had lots of fun, and I hope you too enjoyed this Railfan journey through the mountains.